The envelope found me at closing time, when the post office windows wore the fog like morning veils, and the lamps blinked with a nickel-colored tremor. My name was written across the front in a schoolmaster's hand. Tall capitals, a stern slant, no flourishes to distract a lie from its duty. No return address, only a Philadelphia cancellation. The year had smudged to a gray bruise that could have been 1889, or the city's heartbeat. The clerk set it down as if it might recall a debt. Came up from dead letters. He said, voice low, a pencil behind his ear, like a thinned out, "Your Vale. Evening Bulletin. Someone took their time finding you." The flap's gum cracked with a sound like fragile ice giving up. The paper inside had yellowed to a disciplined gray, creased twice, each fold as straight as an oath. What wasn't disciplined was the writing medium. Not ink. A dried brown-red, iron-rich, the exact color of old roses and pennies after rain. The room leaned toward me as I read. I, Eamon K. Doyle, being of sound mind, sign this on November 6th, 1889, knowing I am already a ghost, to men who prefer obedient facts. They will call my death a private weakness. They will file it where they file other conveniences. Let this reach the living when the city is ready to be ashamed. The next line slid into my pulse like a match head striking. Thomas Vale, if the lamp's stutter in the fog shows a seam of silver, you are reading at the hour I arranged. You will think coincidence. You will be wrong. There is a key in my daughter's house, a ledger in a room the sun forgot, and a door in a prison wall that laughs when men lie. 40 years is the only bribe time accepts. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man the newspapers had folded and shelved. Eamon K. Doyle, detective, 5th District, officially dead by his own hand. Winter of 1889. The last stroke of his name ended in a pollen-sized starburst, where some quill, or whatever artery he'd borrowed, pressed too hard and said more than it meant. Someone thumped the glass door, and the clerk jumped. The lamps blinked once, that stingy city blink, and steadied. The fog pressed closer to the panes. When I looked back at the page, I saw a trick of light, or something worse. The carmine had softened, just enough to whisper. People say Philadelphia remembers everything it cannot forgive. In 1929, the city wore its memory like a heavy overcoat, sensible, gray, frayed at the cuffs. I was 36. My hat had seen better men, and my typewriter liked truth the way drunks, like a final glass. Too much. I rented a room on a block where the buildings leaned together like conspirators whose time had nearly come. I carried Doyle's letter down Market as the L roared overhead and shook the fog into bronze confetti. The reading terminal clock shivered toward 7. On the curb, a thin carmine seam winked from a puddle a trolley had sliced. I knew Doyle by reputation. The tidy tragedy of the official story, the less tidy rumor of a man who'd found names that owned the room and paid to make sure the room forgot him. Before we go further, before we ask the fog to tell us what it is, Sabine, tell me, in the comments, which city and country should be our next haunt. Buenos Aires, Argentina, Lisbon, Portugal, Kyoto, Japan. Shadows collect passports. Your choice sharpens the next blade. I fed a nickel into the payphone outside a cigar store and called the Historical Society. Esther Lowry answered on the second ring, voice made of paper cuts, smoke, and thoroughness. I need a ghost, I said, and told her which one. Eamon Doyle, she said. I'll pull his jacket and see who tugged the cuffs. Come by in the morning. Bring coffee strong enough to apologize. My landlady's stare groaned a greeting and a warning when I climbed to my room. I read Doyle again. The way you read a letter that didn't just find you, but chose you. On the street below, a newsboy rehearsed, shouting about other men's disasters. The lamp on my desk gave a faint, silver twitch. I put the letter under my pillow like a fragile promise, and told myself I didn't do that, because it felt like a heart. The Historical Society on Locust is where the city keeps the things it doesn't want to step on. A smell of dust and the discipline of old wood. Esther met me in a sweater the gray of courtroom steps, hair pinned in an argument with time, a cigarette, doing the arithmetic of her patience. You're Doyle, she said, tapping a folder that had learned to accept handling. Born 1856. Blue ribbons, 4 arrests, testimonials that read like good furniture. Then, a resizing, of his luck. Officially, melancholia, whiskey, debts. Unofficially, he started tugging on threads that ran under rooms with rugs. See if these names give you hives. Judge Horatio Archer, Chief Samuel Gregg, Banker Silas Pembroke. They show up together like a bad chord. She slid a clipping toward me. The tidy column about a detective who'd done the city the courtesy of an easy narrative. A second folder waited, darker by a shade. The paper, a deep, undeveloped photo. Gray, a clerk in the 1890s, had flagged it anomalous postal confiscations and lists, receipts, notes to self-written by men who never expected strangers with better light to read them. 3 items sang louder than the others. A small bronze key tag 1489, an inventory of sealed ledger, unnumbered, and a redirected envelope. Address TV, Esther said. Eyebrows uprighting. You just earned yourself a superstition. I keep a few in my pocket, I said. The city hates to see a man under-preppered. She rolled out a map, and a line in old carmine ink traced a path from Marlborough Street in Fishtown to the 5th District Station. Onward to Moyamensing Prison, Tento Atin, unpromising rectangle labeled DLO Subbasement, 9th and Chestnut. A subtle second line, penciled decades later by a clerk who had learned to whisper on paper, arrowed from that basement to Private Bolts, Pembroke and Sons. The dead letter office, Esther said. Our local purgatory, not Washington's, a municipal sidemouth where the city chews what it can't swallow. Doyle's daughter, I asked. Ruth, Esther said. Widowed. 2 sons. Family never left the neighborhood. Grief and rent are both convincing landlords. We walked out under a sky the color of wet slate, and a man in an overpressed suit pretended to be just passing the steps. He had a jaw built for verdicts and eyes of polished brass. He looked at us long enough to be noticed and short enough not to be remembered by men who don't take notes. When he turned away, the door behind him sighed as if it had held its breath. Ruth Doyle's house faced a street that had learned a patient kind of sorrow. She opened the door with hands that knew when to be gentle and when to stop. When I said Eamon, the muscles around her mouth did a calculation. When I said letter, the answer hurt. He promised to be late if he couldn't be on time, she said, and led us to a narrow desk with drawers that stuck out of habit, not malice. In the back of the bottom one, lying in a little nest of rag, we found a bronze key on a red string. The metal had patented into old stories. The tag said 1489, in digits that could have paid their taxes. My father said it opened an arithmetic problem in a wall, Ruth said. He taught me knots. For waiting. We all heard it at once. A step on the stoop that wanted to be a shadow. The knob twitched, then a retreat, a weight shifting away with the confidence of men who can come back any time. Ruth didn't look at the door. She looked at me. If you brought my father into the light, keep him there. Don't hand him back to men who like the dark because they own the light switch. I'll try, I said, which is a promise honest men make when they mean to keep 2 promises at once. We took the key to 9th and Chestnut, because some answers require a basement. The dead letter office has a smile for the public and a frown for its conscience. The clerk at the counter wore her hair like a rule and spoke in the clean cut of paper edges. I showed her the tag number as if it were a letter of introduction. Inspection logs. She said, amused but not surprised, You gents love to romance errors. You just missed one of our inspectors. Calhoun? I asked, and watched her eyes not move. We don't keep names on the menu, she said. Basement stairs, are to your right. Don't wake anything that bites. The stairs delivered us to a room arranged like an apology. Rows and rows of sacks and shelves, all labeled, all dusty, all patient. The single bulb overhead drew a pallid circle and paid no attention beyond it. I found the ledger shelf and ran my finger along the spines like a priest choosing the right sin. A book fell by itself, as if choosing me. Vale, said a voice, the syllable dry. The man from the steps, the overpressed suit, drifted from an aisle, flipping a ledger he had no right to hold, collecting. It's a banker's vice. I prefer journalism, I said. Less collateral, more blood pressure. Compliance, he said, tapping where a badge would be if it needed to be seen. We keep the city's digestion steady. He put the ledger back in the wrong place, with the care of a man replacing a finger. He left by a door that wasn't a door until he used it. The bulb stuttered. A sack slid an inch. Somewhere in the house above us, a clock kept time no one had asked it to. The shelf began to lean, not panic, decision. Books poured down with soft slaps, a gray rain of paper and bindings. I dove between ladders and felt a ledger kiss my jaw. A tag streaked my cheek in faint carmine, the city's idea of humor. When I cleared the rubble, I found the thing the shelf had seemed to be hiding, a tarnished brass plate near the floor, almost black with neglect. I rubbed it with my sleeve until letters learned to be visible. Docket 611, Archer. Beneath it, a narrow aperture like a keyhole that didn't feel like a keyhole. The bronze key in my pocket warmed as if remembering a friend. Primera tria, de Italiano. Teeth didn't match. The plate belonged to a different conversation. Detective O'Leary's jaw arrived before the rest of him. A brown coat, hat low, hands where men put them when they want to be counted. Miss Lowry phoned, he said. Said you'd gone, spelunking with a tinderbox and a grudge. Doyle, I said, and showed him the edge of the letter without the names. He took in the carmine with the professional boredom of a man who has dated every kind of trouble once and learned their tells. He found a body he couldn't afford, and wrote down the names that owned the ledger, O'Leary said. Then he forgot the first rule, which is, don't make the city choose, he said. It's better at it than you. He eyed the brass plate. You didn't see that. And I didn't either. When men like Archer carve their initials into the bones of a place, the letters never wear off. The ledger I'd pulled had a notation I shouldn't have seen. 1489 key retained, pending docket. A pencil in a hand darker than graphite had added, resolved to satisfaction. No signature. Men like that don't sign. The city signs for them. Later, in gray. Upstairs, the fog had thickened to a pewter cloth. The clerk at the counter watched us with a small, professional concern. Find your error, she asked. It found us, I said. When we stepped outside, the man in the pressed suit stood across the street, under a lamp that warmed his brass eyes without softening them. He wasn't smoking, but he held his hand as if a cigarette were there, because the gesture suited him. When we looked, he didn't move. When we didn't, he did. At Ruth's that evening, the house made small adjustments, wood deciding to be wood for another winter. We let the key sit in the center of the table on its red string. It looked like a punctuation mark that had been promoted. Eastern State, Ruth said finally. If there's a door that laughs, that's where it's learned. We made a plan, made of patience and cheap coffee. We would go after sundown. We would ask a guard, who still knew stories. We would listen to stone like you, listen to a person, for what it says, and for what the silence around it is trying to explain. On the way back to my room, a trolley screamed short and stopped long a block away. People gathered the way they do when the city has opened its mouth and everyone hopes not to see their own name. I kept walking because I'd already seen mine. By day, the main post office at 9th and Chestnut wears columns like excuses. By night, its steps host a fog that considers itself invited. We came with a thermos for the clerk, and that small bribe parted the air. She slid a key across like we were borrowing a book no one would miss. Don't stay below when the tubes wake, she said. They don't understand men. Tubes? I'd heard the stories. Pneumatic mail, shooting through arteries of pipe. Messages racing under the city like thoughts a man pretends he won't have again. We went down. The dead-letter basement is a country of sacks. The smell is old glue and older paper, with a metallic underlayer that lives between penny and regret. Our bulb clicked on and thought about failure. The aisles made a maze, whose walls moved if you wanted to know where you were. Somewhere a fan turned lazily and pushed the dust around without changing anything. We didn't notice the whistling at first. High, thin, testing. Then a thump from behind a far wall. A gulp of hair, and the pneumatic line woke like a dragon having a second thought. Brass gates shivered. A hatch side open. A leather cylinder popped in and rolled to a stop against my shoe. The tag on its strap said internal. Expedite. O'Leary looked like a man choosing between being righteous and being practical. He let practical win by a nose. Openeth, he said. We expected a misfile. What we got was architecture. A blueprint in pencil on vellum, the lines neat as Doyle's letter, the annotations patient and unhurried. It showed a chute beginning behind a brass plate, just like the one with Archer's name, dipping to clear a foundation wall, then rising into a private vault room in a bank whose floor plan, labeled in a hand that respected its outlines, matched Pembroke and Sons. Along the margins, initials and dates. In one corner, a signature that had learned not to be ostentatious. El Calhoun, 1902. Your inspector, O'Leary said softly. He tried to fix the plumbing and found out the water belonged to someone else. The tube hummed again. Another leather cylinder coughed into the tray and bumped the first like a friend late to the train. Inside this one, a routing card. Docket 611 confirmed. Let Silvermen sleep. The ink was fresh enough to have an opinion. Someone else was awake. Tonight, down here, or above, or ebony. We moved like men in a room with thin glass. In the next aisle, a stack of sacks slouched and redistributed gently, as if something behind them had exhaled. The brass plate near the floor had a twin 30 feet away. We found 3 more after that, all tarnished into humility, all hiding a sliver of dark that looked like a keyhole's idea of discretion, a footstep where no foot should be. Not loud, intimate, the pressed suit man appeared between one breath and the next, as if he'd been practicing. He didn't bother with the lapel tap this time. He didn't need to say compliance anymore. The room understood. Gentlemen, he said, Mrs. Doyle, Archivist Lowry. He let the fact he knew Esther's name sit on the table because he enjoyed the wait. You're keeping odd hours with the city's leftovers. Leftovers make fine soup, Esther said, lighting a cigarette she'd saved for an enemy. He waved smoke aside with 2 fingers and the impatience of men accustomed to clearer air. You don't want what's at the end of this, he said, nodding at the blueprint. You want the sense of yourself you'll keep if you don't finish your curiosity. Ruth stepped forward, chin small and armored. My father wrote a letter with his name at the bottom when the city refused to keep it. We're just delivering it. He didn't smile. Men like him save smiles for mirrors, then deliver it someplace I don't have to clean up. He looked at O'Leary. Detective. Citizen, O'Leary said, returning the courtesy wrong. Things happen slow, and then the tube screams. The pneumatic system took a deep breath, and the brass gates snapped shut on their rails. Air shuddered through the pipes. The blueprint tried to fly. The leather container rolled toward the hatch as if magnetized. I grabbed it. O'Leary grabbed me. The pressed man flicked his wrist, and a small chain slithered out of a pocket like an argument. He looped it across the hatch. Curiosity kills envelopes, he said, and let the chain settle. You can hear a building think if you stand very still in its basement and listen. This one decided against us. The shelf on our left leaned another degree. Paper sighed. A ledger book fell, and then another, and then 20. Spines thumping like a muted. O'Leary shoved. I ducked. Ruth slid under a swinging sack with the grace of someone who had been poor long enough to be nimble, and Esther swore with scholarship. The man in the suit had already moved. An economy you can't teach. One step to avoid a corner, one lowering of the head to let fate pass. When the quiet returned, the tube had stopped. The chain hung loose over a hatch that now only had its own weight to keep it honest. Esther's cigarette made a stubborn, silver thread. We took what we could. The blueprint, a rubbing of the Archer plate, the routing card with its sleepy silver men, and went up the stairs in a single file that had learned about humility. Outside, the fog had decided to be thick again. The lamps turned it a map of unhelpful seas. The man in the suit didn't follow, because he was already everywhere. O'Leary lit a match, shielded it with his hand, let himself look like a saint unjustly painted. Next, he said, you go to Eastern State. You show the walls your key. You see if they keep a sense of humor. Will you be there? I asked. I'm already there, he said, and left. We chose midnight because the guards play cards at midnight and because some doors only admit people who have said they belong to the dark. We walked up Fairmount under a sky the color of a secret a city tells itself and pretends not to believe. The penitentiary squats like a fortress that lost the habit of moving. Stone, iron, intent. The guard at the small gate had a face that had retired in place. Ruth said her father's name and the year, and the guard's eyes moved like a man remembering a song that had been sung off-key at a funeral. He let us in with a nod that made no promises. Inside, cold is not a temperature, it's a policy. We walked down a corridor where our footfalls sounded like other people's mistakes. On the south wing, a bricked arch had a different age than its neighbors. Someone had scratched a Latin scrap into wet mortar, a churchy optimism that wasn't in the budget post TNAB RAS looks after darkness. Invoices, Esther muttered, but I saw her fingers brush the letters like a talisman. We found the escutcheon at Shinhide, tarnished into privacy. The bronze key went in with the relief of a vow rediscovered. Turning it made the wall decide to be a door. Iron showed itself with the reluctant honesty of a fact at trial. The room beyond smelled like lime and the official version of silence. The iron box in the wall had 3 locks. One common, one clever, one bronze, with a kind of patience you only meet at wakes. The common gave up. The clever waited its turn. The bronze accepted our key, with that particular intimacy metal learns after long promises. Inside lay a stack of envelopes tied with a thread that had once been red and now had decided on a color you could call history. On the floor of the box, a mechanism sat with the dignity of an old animal. A dial with 40 marks, a narrow mouth where a letter could be fed, a chute sunk in stone that hummed faintly like a distant hive. Ruth took the top envelope and did not open it. She pressed it flat with the palm of her hand like a memory. On the one beneath, a name weighted in carmine that looked fresher than chemistry allows. Thomas Vale. "You take that one," she said, "in case your courage needs a partner later." The corridor coughed, and a shadow decided to be a man. O'Leary again, hat brims, making a line of honor. He looked at the mechanism, the envelopes, the red thread, the 40 marks with their neat arithmetic. He whistled low, not for effect, but from the habit of admiration. "Your ghost built the post office a conscience," he said. "He built a schedule," Esther said, squinting at the dial. 40 clicks, 40 years. She ran a finger along the marks. "Wind it today, and the city gets an unwanted birthday gift in 1969. Wind it then, and the city gets the math again in 2009. It's a metronome of shame. Steps again, this time plural, men who didn't know how to be quiet because they had never been asked to." The pressed suit man's outline filled the arch in a way that made me feel the measurements of my life. Flanking him, 2 shapes made of hired muscle and surplus appetite. "Artifacts," he said, looking at the envelopes like a farmer looks at a tool he can't admit he needs. "They make people poetic. Poetry makes juries sleepy. Hand me the stack, and I'll give you a receipt." "You'll give us a wall," Ruth said. "The same one you gave my father." He considered drawing a pistol and decided the acoustics were wrong for it. He tried something more like truth. "You publish, and a committee drinks coffee at a long table. A judge frowns. A banker resigns theatrically and keeps his money. Your names go on a list that is longer than you are. You get to live in a city that indulges you. Or you hand me the childish parts and keep the part where you feel like better people." He reached as if reaching were a compromise. O'Leary moved quietly, with a practice that made his coat not quite move. One of the hired appetites reached for Ruth. She stepped back exactly once, and in that step showed a woman's entire biography. Esther flicked ash on the man's cuff, a very small blessing. I spun the dial 1 notch backward, an instinct, an indecency, a prayer, and the mechanism answered with a soft, decisive click. Somewhere inside the wall, a small bronze idea woke and began to count. We didn't fight our way out. We negotiated our way out with space. O'Leary gifted us a narrow corridor by occupying the part of it that men respect. The press suit man stepped aside because he didn't like what would happen to his hat. Ruth carried the envelopes under her coat, like someone who has never once mistaken worth for weight. Esther walked like a librarian leaving a fire with the only books that matter. Back on Fairmount, the fog had decided to be generous. It gave us cover all the way to Delaware Avenue and a door to a cold storage warehouse where Ruth's eldest son worked nights. He had keys, a knack for minds that require thermostats, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask to be admired. "You'll want the trunk," he said. Before we could ask, the old one that swears in brass. The cold storage back room had a smell I associate with winter and strategy. A trunk with a brass plate sat against a wall that did not know it was hiding anything. The lock didn't like our key, but preferred us to other possibilities. Inside, wax cylinders, labeled in a hand that ordered a man's life interview. Jan. Archer, bank office. Pembroke, counting room. Calhoun, tube plan. Beside them, a phonograph whose horn had a dent where someone who didn't understand music had attempted a point. We set the machine on a table that had been faithful to 1,000 boxers of peaches. The first cylinder crackled, then steadied as if taking our measure. Doyle's voice filled the cold, and the cold seemed to like him. Measured, unsentimental, a man who believed in verbs. He described a body pulled from the Schuylkill tied to the idea of bricks. He described a meeting under a bank's ceiling where watches lied in unison. Archer's voice like formaldehyde, Gregg's like a ledger closing, Pembroke's like a smile that had turned. A fourth man spoke, and the cylinder hissed as if a sleeve had brushed a microphone in 1889 and decided to keep at it. Men in rooms with rugs say order when they mean obedience, Doyle said. They say public when they mean their friends. They say suicide when they mean budget. Ruth's hand found my wrist and wrapped it in a count. The next cylinder made polite, careful noises and gave us Calhoun. Younger, more hopeful, the kind of hope that can get a man to inventory a mechanism designed to starve correspondence. He described the brass plates, the cords, the pulleys behind the dead-letter shelves, the secret chute that yawned into a private vault under Pembroke's bank. He had drawn it. He had sent the drawing through the tube to someone who might help. He had kept a copy because he trusted the city the way a dog trusts thunder. We were 3 cylinders deep when the storage room's door breathed. O'Leary came in, as if the wind had been saving. He looked at the horn, as if he expected to hear his own name, and was prepared to dislike the accent. "You have enough?" he said. "For what?" I asked. "For shame," he said. "Nothing more. Probably enough for now." He put an envelope on the table, addressed in Doyle's hand to Francine Calhoun. Inside, a letter that apologized without wasting time, and a sketch of the bank vault with one more annotation, a second entrance through a freight elevator shaft. Sealed after a fatal accident, no one had thought to file correctly because the dead boy had the wrong sort of last name. Esther exhaled smoke at the ceiling like a sacrament. "We steal the ledger. We steal the room," O'Leary said. "Sometimes the absence paints a clearer face. We made a scouting party of 2, O'Leary and me, because I had the habit of getting in and out of rooms without making men resent their furniture. Ruth stayed with the cylinders. Esther stayed with Ruth, a librarian's hand on a mother's shoulder. A small city formed in miniature. Pembroke and Sons liked to present itself to the street as a fatherly institution. Marble, bronze rails, a clock whose hands never ebbed. At midnight, that clock stuttered anyway, because the fog had decided to find it. O'Leary and I slipped into an alley that specialized in forgotten deliveries. The freight elevator groaned in the pit like a reluctant witness. The padlock on the access door didn't resist with conviction. We pried the gate with our best imitation of silence, and found a ladder that had opinions about men. Down 2 flights, the air concentrated. You could feel the tubes as a pressure the way you feel an argument before the words arrive. A narrow stone passage led to a small room that thought highly of itself. Thick walls, bronze locks, a table in the center with a rectangle of clean dust. On the floor, scuffs shaped like expensive shoes, pivoting in small circles. On the table, a single coin with Archer's face cut into its side on a jeweler's dare. The ledger was gone, but it had left an outline of its body. I took a photograph with a reporter's Eastman, the flash eating half the air and leaving powder like a vow. Footsteps wrote a sentence in the shaft. The press suit man stepped through the door in that style of men who do as they please, as if the hinges had been trained for him. "You love absences," I said. "They're clean," he said. "They forgive. Also, they are easy to deny in court." "You stole a city's throat," O'Leary said. "We rented it," the man said, "and paid better than your editor ever will." He wasn't alone. Men who own rooms rarely practice solitude. 2 assistants with hands like coughs flanked him. O'Leary showed them a warrant that preferred daylight. The man showed us a pistol he had hoped not to use, I showed him a flashbulb. You can't call it a fight. It was a rearrangement. O'Leary's fist explained itself to a jaw. My flash blinded a man whose job was to notice before he acted. The press suit man shot the floor for punctuation. We left by the elevator cage because someone had to decide to keep breathing, and we were nearest to the decision. Bacon Walnut Rain wrote admonitions on the pavement in traffic, coughed like old men telling jokes. O'Leary walked with his hat in his hand, which is either humility or calculation. We have enough. Essaida Gain and I began to believe him, and to hate belief for being late. We wrote that night, as if keys were due. I wrote the way you stamp your foot on a floor to test which boards will keep you. Esther wrote captions like verdicts. Ruth curled around the cylinders like a spell, and listened to her father after 40 winters. Of the house addressing her in the third person. Somewhere, the man in the suit tabulated how certain a day's work could feel, and whether it could be undone by a sharper sentence. At dawn, a trolley on Gerrard. Wind too long. A boy threw a newspaper that had learned to travel edge. The city pulled its coat around itself and chose a face for mourning. The day the story ran. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. United States practiced an old American habit. It said it was surprised by the thing you told it had been happening all along. Men who pronounced Archer's name like a vow yesterday pronounced it today like a dental procedure. Pembroke and Sons tellers wore the frown cash-proof. Chief Gregg grew a toothache in the right molar of his career. A committee formed, as committees do, from men whose chairs know them better than their wives. My editor pretended boredom in the way of men who can't risk eating in front of you when all the food is yours. But you can't shame a city without the city trying to shame you back. We found it in the ways doors didn't open, in the letters returned misaddressed, even when they had been written on our palms, in a knock at Ruth's that stopped being a knock and tried its hand at being an ultimatum. They didn't break the door. That would have required admission. They let themselves in and rearranged the furniture of threat. 2 men in brown coats that did the courtesy of not fit. 1 set of hands to clean, 1 set too rough. Ruth stood in the doorway between kitchen and living room and let them count on her stopping them. Esther sat on the couch like it was a judge and she was ready to be introduced to its honor. The cylinders, the clean-handed one said. The letters, Teki. What you want? Ruth said. And I watched her build a sentence around a hot thing you already had for 40 years. I don't collect your leftovers. They looked at each other in that arithmetic of thugs. How much? How quick? How loud? The rough one took a step and learned the algebra of an archivist's cane. Esther's stick was old wood but current purpose. It cracked against his shin and gave the room a fraction it preferred. The clean one chose me because he thought I would behave. E was wrong. You learned to fight in small ways in a city like ours. Stamp a foot to distract, push a shoulder to miscalculate a door gem. Use weight like a verb. We tumbled into the hall and let the stare decide who wanted the next minute. O'Leary arrived like a period at the end of a run-on sentence. Brief, final, clarifying. They can do this all day, he said after the men found themselves outdoors without their confidence. They have the day. You have the story. Don't confuse those ownerships. We moved the cylinders again. A ritual by now. To a place that could chill in more ways than temperature. Delaware Avenue hummed with a hard-working quiet that paid rent. In the back room, Ruth lowered the needle onto a wax groove like a woman setting down a child who needed sleep. Doyle spoke again. A list of names that had not aged well. Locations that had turned into other uses. Sums that looked small now but had the habit of multiplying consequences. He described a clockmaker on Sansom who filed gears for men that time preferred. He described a blind orgaist at St. Augustine's who could tell you which men left their hats on during prayer. He described a steamfitter who refused a bribe and died of winter too soon. He did not say the 4th name at the bank. Each time he got near it, the sound scratched a scar that returned, a defect that had been purchased. I went to the clockmaker. He worked by ear with a patience that ought to be billable. Doyle, I said, and saw the old man's fingers pause on a spring like a sentence deciding on a verb. He bought a regulator clock and asked me to ruin it. The clockmaker said, not so it wouldn't keep time, but so it would keep a different time. He wanted a stutter at the 40-minute mark. He said it would teach someone a lesson who had never learned to wait. Men with certain names don't wait. They expect time to hold their coat. What did you do? What he paid me for, the man said. What I paid myself for was forgetting who he asked me to give it to. The blind organist gave me a psalm and a list of shoes. Men who think they're taller than God keep their hats on, he said. Men who think God is busy hold them under the pew. Men who know God's secretary take them off slowly so the room can notice. And the steamfitter's widow gave me a photograph. Him outside a manhole, rain crawling down his coat. The kind of tired that lives in bone-knot muscles. On the back, in a hand that tried to be careful, "Don't take the easy money. There isn't any." I published these small pieces of the city's confession the way a man throws gravel ahead of him to find the road in fog. The big story made noise. The pebbles made music. Meanwhile, the press suit man lost patience at exactly the rate Pry does. He had us followed in better suits. He asked a city inspector to inspect my boarding house, and discovered exactly 3 fire hazards, and no shame. He wrote my editor a letter that sounded like a compliment if you read it in a mirror. Then, because men like him are at heart impatient romantics, he made a mistake. He tried to buy Esther. They sent a boy dressed like a clerk to leave a fountain pen on her desk, gold nib, mother of pearl, a tiny dove engraved where a man who likes to sign quickly will see it. Inside the box, a note on heavy paper, "Miss Lowry, your discretion is already legendary. Let us honor it." A donation to the Society's Acquisitions Fund, a private column in a private ledger to bear your name, a second pen to use when the first tires. She didn't show the pen to me, she showed it to the paper. I ran her acceptance letter on page 2, and the city learned what a librarian sounds like when someone calls her cheap. The boy never came back to retrieve his mistake. That night, the fog put its elbow on the river and leaned. The cylinders sang their last secrets into our small room. Doyle's voice thinned, then strengthened for a final entry. An address on walnut, a sequence of numbers that sounded like a safe and like a metronome. 4040, and a sentence. I wished he hadn't had to write. If I fail, let the letter do what I couldn't. Shame what can be shamed. We went back to the vault because sometimes repetition is strategy. The freight elevator moaned. The access door remembered us and liked us less. Our flash made an amateur noon. The room had changed only in small ways. Dust darker by degrees, a cigarette end, like a punctuation mark that had run out of sentence. On the table where the ledger had rested, a card now, resolved to satisfaction. We had seen that phrase before. It grew no kinder. The tube above hissed, once in a way that made my ears feel threaded. It coughed up a leather cylinder that had lost its own tag and learned humility. Inside, nothing. Or so we thought. Until Esther, who has seen more paper tricks than a courthouse, held the cylinder under the light at an angle, across the inner leather, pressed with a blunt pin. A message? 40. Below. Under. Calhoun again, probably, instructing himself or us. Below the below was the drainage channel that kissed the room's foundation. O'Leary found it the way a man finds a coin in a coat he doesn't deserve. Fingernails, patience, a willingness to look foolish. The grate lifted. A man could crawl. So could a ledger, assisted by men who thought drain pipes were for other people. I went in far enough to get honest with myself. 3 yards, 5, 10, until the tunnel turned, and the air became something a person pays not to breathe. I felt with my hands, and found the absence. Square and faithless, the impression of a book taken recently, carried the way a man carries a thing he won't admit to owning. On the slime-slick stone, under my fingers, a carmine smear so thin it could have been a fancy or a machine's rust. I came back with that color on my fingertips, and O'Leary looked at me like I had returned from a long policy meeting. We write the absence Asa Ida Gain, and I understood he was right, and that being right had not once in his life made him cheerful. Publishing is a kind of burglary that leaves the door open. We ran the room, the tubes, the blueprint, the chain of custody of our shame. We ran Doyle's voice in Calhoun's drawing in Ruth's hands holding an envelope with a red thread like a small arterial line across a paper wrist. Philadelphia did what cities do, argued with itself loudly in public and more loudly in private. Men with offices on the better floors called my editor to practice indignation. A preacher on Spring Garden delivered a sermon about the sin of curiosity and the virtue of patience. A longshoreman pressed my hand in a way that rearranged my knuckles and said, "If they come for you, stand where the light is." A woman in a mill wrote a postcard. I knew about Archer because the girls always knew. Then, the letter changed. In my room, late, the L making its iron lullaby, and the night practicing its lengths. I took Doyle's page from its envelope and read the bottom, because some lines insist. Under his name, the steady hand, the last hard press, a new line had grown as if time had been cultivating it. Thank you. I looked for damp. I looked for forgery. I looked for an answer in the science I could afford. All I found was a faint scent of old iron and a feeling in my ribs like a door opening in the wrong direction. Below the thank you, a sentence had lengthened itself without asking permission. Let this reach the living when the city is ready to be ashamed, and when shame fades, send this again 40 years. You can call that a trick if it helps you draw a straight line through the dark. You can call it chemistry, mischief, fear, optimism. I called it instruction. I called it proof that a city can be trained like a stubborn animal. You don't punish it once. You teach it, calmly, for the rest of your life. Ruth came by after dawn in a coat the right size at last. She looked at the letter, touched the new words as if checking a child's damp forehead. "He always liked schedules," she said. "When you teach a boy to be on time, he grows into a man who writes a metronome into a wall." We went walking because walking in gray air lets you hear yourself tell the truth. The market wagons clattered, hooves scattering small silver noises. The fog laid a bronze tint on the nearest things and a dark wash on the far ones. A boy practiced a trumpet in a second-story window, the same 3 notes repeated until they gave up and agreed to be music. The city felt briefly possible. At the Bulletin, my editor had eyes like tacks in a cigar that wasn't doing either of us any good. "They've formed 2 committees and 1 club," he said. "The club is more dangerous. It meets in rooms where men are friendly because they can afford it." He put a new envelope on my desk. Not Doyle's. Fresh. The hand was my own. I did not remember writing it. Inside, a blank sheet and a red thread, like a joke that trusted me. No words. No instructions, just implication, which is the city's favorite rhetoric. O'Leary came in through a side door and closed it with a discipline that made the hinges behave. He folded himself into the coat rack's shadow and listened while I said nothing. After the amount of silence the room could accept, he said, "A man in a gray hat told me the ledger was on a boat bound for nowhere and that men like me should learn to like that address." "You believe him?" I asked. "I believe in boats," he said, "and in nowhere." He held out something between 2 fingers, the way a man holds a piece of glass he respects. A coin. Not currency. A token with Archer's face imperfectly removed, and the word satisfaction stamped where dignity used to be. "They're leaving these at the places you love," he said. "The library steps, a fish market, your landlady's stoop. It's a language. It says, 'We are not done.'" "Neither are we," Ruth said. And if anyone else had said it, I would have been less sure. Esther arrived with a handful of clippings from 1889 that bore looking at again. A story about a city appropriation to upgrade pneumatic service, a notice about a new vault in the bank on Walnut, a polite line about Judge Archer's illness, pasted in the margin of one, in Anit's old hand she recognized as Calhoun's. "If you can't take the ledger, take the schedule. Make shame regular." "Print that sentence," she said. "Print it. Like scripture." We did. The second day's paper taught the public a word they already knew and hadn't been using out loud. A union man read it in a saloon and repeated it to a man who sold him nails. A schoolteacher read it to a class of boys who were pretending not to listen, and all of them knew the lesson anyway. A woman at Pembroke's bank counted out bills to a man she had loved too long and said schedule as if it were a curse. The city sighed again because it understood what rega meant. The press suit man sent me a note without a return address because men like him don't need to be returned. "You can make waves," he wrote, in the tidy hand of a man educated at an expense. "But we own the shore." I wrote back on paper that looked cheap and wasn't. "You own a calendar?" I said. "We're learning to own a clock." That evening, on the river, the fog performed a trick the river taught it. It rolled low and kept secrets in its folds. I mailed an envelope at the 9th and Chestnut post office to no one. to be delivered when it hurts enough. The clerk with the neat hair took it without looking, hands exact, mouth a line that could mean sympathy or policy. The brass hatch below breathed. Somewhere, a chain rattled with the intimacy of old machinery. I could have heard a heartbeat, if I'd had the right kind of superstition. On my desk that night, I laid the bronze key on its red thread like a medal no one would be proud to earn. The lamp made it small. Silber Studer. The letter made it small. Paper sigh. I told myself these noises were ordinary. I didn't believe me. I copied Doyle's message in my own hand, because even a counterfeit of courage is a rehearsal for the real thing. I did not cut my finger to sign. I pressed a pen hard enough to feel the nib bite the paper and said aloud, "To the empty room. To the city that sleeps with one eye open. To the mechanism that had married bronze to patience. 40 years. Maybe the best trick a dead man can teach the living is how to keep time without clocks." The river took the leftover light and didn't return it. Somewhere in Fishtown, Ruth tried on her new coat and stood in a small mirror that had seen men comb their hair out of various kinds of trouble. Somewhere near Locus, Esther shelved a book that did not yet exist, and that she would live long enough to see a young woman pull down for her own education in How Cities Behave. Somewhere in a bank office, now carefully unoccupied, a man decided to like Europe for a while, and in a room below 9th and Chestnut, a mechanism turned a notch that sounded to me, in my sleep, like a promise with teeth. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more dark and mysterious tales, and don't forget to like this video.